So I think we'll get started. My name is Irene Hamburger, and it is my honor to introduce our speakers tonight. 5 years ago, it would have been hard to imagine front page article about the connection between what we eat and climate change. Nowadays, we would be hard pressed to find an article about climate change that doesn't mention the connection to what and how we eat, and how food waste, food insecurity, and health are all connected to the climate crisis. It is for this reason that we are so thrilled to have on the keynote stage two of our generation's leaders on these topics. Today, we're going to join Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Dr. Kathleen Merrigan in conversation, and I could not be more excited to hear their perspectives. Everyone, get your questions ready. Dr. Johnson's mission is to build community around the solutions for our climate crisis. She has been described as the most influential marine biologist of our time. As CEO of Ocean Collective, she is a coalition builder and assembler of superstars, really superheroes. Take a look at the collective's team of impactful feminists, scientists, artists, and strategists. Ayana is an organizer, a leader of the March for Science, and a policy expert, the co-creator of the Blue New Deal. Along with Catherine Wilkinson, she co-edited the anthology, All We Can Save, a book that we will learn more about tonight, and co-founded the All We Can Save project, which aims to accelerate the success of the climate movement by providing focused support and community building for women climate leaders. And there's more, so much more. She is the co-creator and co-host of the Spotify Gimlet podcast, How to Save a Planet. I could go on, but suffice to say, if there was ever a full biography that is worth a read, it is Ayana Elizabeth Johnson's. It's true.
Thank you, Irene.
You're welcome. You're welcome. A strategic and fearless thinker, Stone Barn Center board member Dr. Kathleen Merrigan has championed sustainability in food and agriculture throughout her career. She is the first executive director of the Sweat Center for Sustainable Food Systems at Arizona State University, and holds the position of the Kelly and Brian Sweat Professor of Practice in Sustainable Food Systems with appointments in the School of Sustainability, College of Health Solutions, and School of Public Affairs. Previously, Dr. Merrigan was the Executive Director of Sustainability at George Washington University, where she led the GW Sustainability Collaborative and GW Food Institute. And we all remember that from 2009 until 2013, Kathleen served as Deputy Secretary and COO of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where she led the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food initiative to support local food systems, and was the key architect of First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign. Ayana, Kathleen, welcome. Thank you both for joining the Young Farmers and Cooks Conference this evening, and can't wait to hear all that you have to say.
Well, thank you, Irene. I get to be the questioner, the person that asks the questions tonight. So I'm really excited to be here. And I'm so sorry we can't all be together at Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture, which is one of the most special places in the world. And the work that they do is really tremendous. Irene and her team, Dan Barber, a marvelous, brilliant cook and intellectual in the world of food. So, but we're here virtually. And I'm so glad it's at the Young Farmers Conference, because there's no challenge greater facing American agriculture than repopulating our working lands with farmers and ranchers. And part of the future is reconnecting in direct ways farmers and ranchers with the chef community. So perfect. All right, so we have this unbelievable keynote speaker. So great to meet you. And we're going to talk a little bit about her book, but I was first looking a little bit on your website, and it had this thing about areas of expertise. And there were a lot of things I expected, like science communication, ocean policy, and all that. But there was also about instigating dance parties. So maybe at the end of our hour here, we can go back to that and you can explain, because that's pretty cool.
I'm a little rusty, I have to say. I haven't instigated that many dance parties this year. My mother, who I lived with upstate New York at her little farm, she, dealt with the brunt of the dance party instigation for 2020, but she's always game.
That's cool. Well, I want to start by saying thank you for your work, your courage, your commitment, your optimism. If you haven't seen this beautiful book, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, you need to get this volume, an edited volume that that was undertaken with a colleague, published this year. And I'm going to start. I'm going to ask 6 or 7 questions, and then, as Irene warned all of you in the virtual audience, we'll give you an opportunity to ask some questions as well. So my first question, and reading this book, just a joyful volume, you begin by sharing a bit of history about a woman named Eunice Newton Foote, the first woman in climate science. Can you tell us about her and why you chose this as your starting point?
Yeah. So I think the way we remember and tell history is so important, right? That becomes the story of who we think we are. And when we leave key elements out of our stories, we sort of mislead ourselves about what the past looked like, and then also what the future could be. And so we started this book with Eunice. I feel like we're on a first name basis, even though we've never met. And Eunice Newton Foote is the scientist who discovered through experiments in her backyard that carbon dioxide would lead to planetary warming. She had these tubes and glass bells, and she did these experiments with the sun and took these measurements and figured this out and published her work in 1856. And it was one of those things that you're just like, Eunice tried to warn us, right? And 3 years later, an Irish physicist named John Tyndall did a similar experiment. He was at a university and had fancier equipment, but found essentially the same thing. And he's credited as, the grandfather of climate science. And it was only in the last few years that I ever even came to hear of Eunice Newton Foote. So we thought it was important to open this book, which is an anthology, as you mentioned, with contributions from 41 women climate leaders and, around 16 poets and these original illustrations. We wanted to start there with her story, not only because of her scientific contributions, but also because she was part of the Seneca Falls Convention. She signed that Declaration for Women's Rights. She was a feminist. And so we like to think of her as the first climate feminist. And that is a tradition that we see ourselves carrying forward, that being both of those things, an advocate for climate solutions and the science that they're based on, and for gender equality should go hand in hand.
I love when you write, you say this phrase, I wonder if Eunice Newton Foote ever found herself remarking, as so many women have, I literally just said that, dude.
Totally. I mean, this guy published in the same journal as her, like he probably read her article. And yeah, I think a lot of us have been there.
Yeah, it's totally cool. So your volume contains essays, poetry, pithy observations, as you say, all from women. And you state at the start that the climate crisis is not gender neutral. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. We know that all over the world, people who are already marginalized in various ways tend to bear the brunt of the climate crisis. And that's true for race. It's true for geography in terms of developing countries. It's true for poverty, and it's also true for gender, because women in a lot of societies bear the majority of the load for taking care of family members, for raising children, for often, getting food on the table with with collecting water, all of these things that become much harder to do when you're living through the impacts of climate change, especially when you're living through extreme weather events and not just the sort of like the steady ticking of change. And so what we wanted to do was, while that is true, we wanted to use this book as an opportunity to look at the other side of that, which is, what are we missing when we don't include women as leaders in climate solutions? Yes, we know who is bearing a disproportionate part of the burden, but it's also true that women are doing an incredible job leading on these issues, whether that's agriculture or architecture or art or law and policy and activism and science. There are women leading in all these areas. And to look at the climate movement until the last year or two, you would never know it. You would think that white men had all the answers and everyone else was just like not engaged. When of course we know that that couldn't be further from the truth. It's just a matter of who has the money and the power and the platforms. And so we thought we could use an anthology to simultaneously uplift dozens of voices and start to expose the true narrative, which is there is incredible work being done, and it's past time to recognize it.
Oh, great. So it's really hard to pick anything in this volume out from so many wonderful things. Like it was tough. But I did want to pull out a few things that really caught my eye. So one of the chapters that I really liked is titled "Water is a Verb" by Judith Schwartz. And I'm going to read a little excerpt, and then if you could comment on it, that'd be great.
Sure.
So she writes, "We generally think of water as a noun, as something bounded by place, a lake, river, or reservoir, that which comes out of a tap." And then she further explains that now she understands water as a verb, expanding in volume and retrenching, changing state in an ongoing dialogue with land and sun. And then at the end of her chapter, and believe me, you all have to read this. This is not a spoiler alert because every line in this book is great. But at the end of the chapter, she writes, "We have so far neglected the role of functional ecological systems in climate regulation." What do you think Judith is really trying to tell us when she's writing "Water is a Verb"?
Yeah. So first, I would like to credit my mother with gifting me one of Judith's books, and my mother, who is a now retired English teacher and current regenerative farmer, she gifted me the book and then told me that my gift to her was to read it for Christmas. And so I read Judith's book. She has an entire book on this theme, and this is an adaptation of one of the chapters of her book. And it rings very true for me as a marine ecologist, knowing that we often think of the ocean as a victim of climate change instead of also as a hero of climate solutions, whether that's offshore renewable energy and all the potential there to power the 40% of our population that lives near the coast in the US, or it's coastal ecosystems that absorb tons of carbon, protect us from storms. They're this physical barrier and are the habitat for all sorts of species that we often rely on as a source of nutrition. So when I read Judith's words about neglecting ecosystems, I do think of one of the things that's missing from this anthology, which is there is no essay about technology. There's no essay about this sort of like techno-utopian, we will just invent our way out of it, and like there will be apps and flying cars and everything will be fine, right? We'll just suck all the carbon out of the air and be done. That is not part of what we chose to put forward in this book, because Catherine, my co-editor, and I really do align with Judith's perspective that we need to think about nature-based solutions much more. And I think we're, especially as we're in this new phase of extreme weather events that farmers are having to deal with both the drought and flood as both being more common, understanding the role of the water cycle. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas. Eroded soils and soils without roots in the ground can't absorb water as well. And so we're losing precious topsoil if we don't manage our agriculture properly. And there's just all of these missed opportunities in a lot of the ways that we grow food that Judith was helping to point out, which I think is, I think it's just so beautiful that she writes, the beautiful thing is that there is nothing we have to engineer. Nature does it for us. Basically what we need is life to transport water and by extension to regulate heat, life to seed rain, life to slow down moving water so that it has the chance to infiltrate. And so this essay that you highlighted, Judith, is part of a whole section of the book called Nourish, which is all about agriculture and our food system, and actually includes a poem by my mother, which is kind of a hoot.
Cool. Well, maybe we'll turn to that. Okay, another part, and of course, I'm a little bit more focused on the Nourish part, being an Aggie and all. So another chapter that really caught my eye was the one that was written by Leah Penniman, who wrote a chapter called Black Gold. And of course, we're all reading Farming While Black, and that's gotten a lot of buzz. But I want to also read an excerpt of her chapter and then ask you to comment on it. So she writes, Black people have had a sacred relationship with soil that far surpasses our 246 years of enslavement and 75 years of sharecropping in the US. For many, this period of land-based terror has devastated that connection. Oh, sorry, I gotta keep going up here. We have confused the subjugation of our ancestors that they experienced on the land with the land herself, naming her the oppressor and running toward paved streets without looking back. So I was reading this in the same week that Senator Cory Booker introduced legislation in the US Senate that features a scheme to provide land to Black farmers. So I'm just wondering, what do you see in your crystal ball when it comes to Black farmers and generally people of color and American agriculture? Where might this go?
Yeah, well, my first thought goes to the next two sentences that close that paragraph. We do not stoop, sweat, harvest, or even get dirty because we imagine that would revert us to bondage. Part of the work of healing our relationship with soil is unearthing and relearning the lessons of soil reverence from the past. And that is the work that Leah is doing with all of her collaborators at Soulfire Farm, is giving people the opportunity to reconnect with nature, reconnect with Indigenous, African, Black practices of agriculture. And I think that is something that is very much needed, because when we think about the barriers to diversity in all fields, people are like, it's a pipeline problem, or like, we just can't find any Black people, who know anything about this. And I think often that that's a cop-out, because the situations that we actually have are that people don't feel welcome. They don't see themselves as a part of whatever the thing is. And so her work is so critical, because it says, like, we have always been a part of this. People braided rice grains into their hair when they were ripped from their home communities in Africa and brought here as slaves, because they knew how important that was. And it was those Africans who taught white colonists how to grow rice, in the South, in the US. It was those practices. So sort of like reverting to this sense of like pride in the expertise of agriculture that is at the root of a lot of these older ways that we are coming back to as we realize that industrial farming does not serve us, I think is something that we'd really like to see. And another part of the work that Leah is leading has to do with land reparations, with people donating land that then gets redistributed to Black farmers, because even with all of the odds against them, Black Americans at one point owned something like 14% of agricultural land, and that's now down to 1%, in large part because of policies from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so how can we make that right? And I think this year with the pandemic, we've seen a lot of people want to reconnect with nature, want to reconnect with their food systems, become more aware of sort of the tenuous supply chains that we are all at the end of. And so this may well be because of the confluence of that with the climate crisis, with the movement for Black lives. I think this is a moment where if nurtured, we could start to see a new generation of people leading when it comes to agriculture, which would be really wonderful, because as you sort of described, that could not be more needed, right? We need to get people back on the land. We need to have more farmers and younger farmers. We have this like incredibly aging farming population in the United States. So it really is an opportunity to say like, okay, this is an inflection point. What do we want the future to look like? And what policies and practices do we want to uplift? Because the US government subsidizes the heck out of agriculture, but what parts of it are we subsidizing? And so this is a chance to make decisions about what we value in that space.
Well said. We've poured a lot of money into the system the last couple of years in particular. So it leads to my next question perfectly, and that is, we're on the cusp of a new administration in Washington and having our first female vice president, yay. So you write in your book, or you note that when parliaments have greater representation of women, they're more likely to ratify environmental treaties. Mm-hmm. I note that you have a chapter by Gina McCarthy, now head of the Natural Resources Defense Council, but previously President Obama's second EPA administrator, a very smart and very fierce and very funny lady. She's a climate feminist. We need more like her. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, are you ready to run for office?
Me?
Uh-huh. You always have to have a surprise question in the bunch.
No, I don't think that sounds like any fun at all. This is the election I've been most engaged with though in my entire life. I think that's probably true for a lot of us. And that started in the primary actually with the Blue New Deal and getting involved in envisioning like, what does the future of ocean climate policy look like? Because I looked at the Green New Deal resolution, which I always feel like I have to say, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It is only 13 pages and it is double spaced with quite large font. It'll take you like 5 minutes to read it, and we can have like a real discussion as citizens about like whether we think that's the right direction to go in, instead of just like fighting a straw man that's not what the thing actually is. But I read it and I got to page 10 or so and I see the word ocean for the first time. And I was like, oh man, they're really blowing it. Just like things we should protect include blah, 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 ocean. And I was like, the ocean is trying to save us. Let's give it like a little bit more of a role. And so with some colleagues, I started crafting this concept of a Blue New Deal to be a complement to the Green. And then that got picked up by Elizabeth Warren's campaign, and I ended up co-authoring her Blue New Deal plan, and then speaking with the Biden campaign about how they could carry some of those ideas forward, and now talking to the transition team about how they might pick up some of that stuff. So I'm happy to be helpful in policy making, but I think being a politician and like running for office sounds like no fun, but I will help out those who want to champion these ideas in those ways.
Fair enough. And thanks for all that hard work. I would say one of the real critiques of food system work to date is that you don't see enough about fisheries, the ocean, and you think about how many people in the world depend upon fish as part of their nutrition. I don't know why we've had these really separate conversations, why you were in a situation where we had a Green New Deal and a Blue New Deal, but hopefully the next wave of food system thinking will knit it together, excuse me, in a more forceful and thoughtful way. We'll see. All right, so I love the poem Being Human.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how you say her first name. Naima? Naima. Okay, Naima Penman. She said, I can't take the time to read it all, but I want to read the first stanza of this poem, which I love. And it goes, I wonder if the sun debates dawn. Some mornings not wanting to rise out of bed from under the down feather horizon. Oh, that's just so beautiful. But it made me think, some days we just want to hide under the covers. And you open this wonderful book by writing, when you're close to the problem, you're necessarily close to the solutions. And then you close your book writing that from personal acts to professional prowess to political participation, our layers of agency are more profound than we may realize. So this is you, the optimist, and I love it. So tomorrow morning, when we climb out of bed, what do you suggest we do?
That's the perfect framing of that question. Thank you for that. I would suggest that you look yourself in the face and ask yourself, what am I good at? What magic can I contribute to the climate solutions we already have at our fingertips? Because I feel that one of the major failings of the climate movement to date has been that we've asked everyone to do the same thing. We've asked everyone to march and donate and spread the word and vote. And believe me, we absolutely need to do all those things. But if that's all we ask of people, then people aren't able to bring their special skills to the table, right? If I were doing the same thing, Kathleen, as you were doing, what a waste of both of our talents. And so I think there's this, I think of it as this like Venn diagram, right? Between like, what are you really good at? What is the work, that needs doing? And like, what gets you out of bed in the morning? And like where those three circles overlap, like how can you get as much of your energy as possible into that intersection? That's what I would suggest you do. And it seems like a cop-out because like I don't have like 5 tips for you to do, but like we really need to figure out like how we bring our special magic to this work. And I don't know what yours is, but you do.
Well, I love that. I remember when I was my first years as a university professor, I would assign my students papers to write, and they would do a marvelous job detailing the problem, whether it was about soil health or water conservation or loss of farm, whatever. They would do this really great job. And then it would be like the last paragraph or two, they'd sort of throw out a solution, not very well developed. And at a certain point in my practice of teaching, I put a rule in place that at least a third, if not a half of the paper needed to be solution focused, so that they would give
I love that
full time. Yeah. So I really like this. And I guess being on a college campus, I feel this has been such a horrific year.
Can I ask you a question?
Does it work that way? Sure.
I feel like, there are rules, but like, I'm curious, like, because you also share this emphasis on solutions, what is currently your favorite climate solution?
Yeah, my favorite climate solution. Well, I am all excited.
Like picking a favorite child, but like, whatever, let's throw caution to the wind.
Yeah, so I'm really big on organic agriculture. I think people who know me know that about me. And I think that a lot of the practices organic farmers have been really advancing over decades are really helpful for soil health and for carbon sequestration and for overall ecosystem health. So sometimes I like to say, with all the excitement about regenerative agriculture, which I think is good, but there's a lot to learn from organic. And I don't know if everyone understands that crop rotation is the cornerstone of organic agriculture in terms of the rules. And a lot of the agroforestry practices that I love, like silvopasture and those sort of things, organic guys are doing those. They're not so much practiced in the United States as they are around other parts of the world. So I'm really optimistic about organic agriculture. I also hosted a forum with Food Tank in the University of Hawaii, along with ASU in January, on the wisdom of indigenous foodways. And I think we have a lot to learn from indigenous knowledge. We don't want to appropriate it. We want to value it, honor it, learn from it. And I just know, living myself in Arizona, where water scarcity is a daily reality, it's interesting to see, for example, what the Hopi do with dryland farming. So I think there's a lot of new things that I've learned living in my new state, and I'm excited about those.
I'm so glad I asked. Thank you.
Well, okay, so I should probably let some of the people in the audience share their questions, but my last one is, so being at a college campus, this year students are so stressed. They're so stressed. And I'm really, really tickled when they're willing to admit it. Not tickled's the wrong word, but I'm just proud of them that they have the courage to say, I'm struggling. But between the pandemic and being isolated, and then real deep fear around climate, students are stressed about climate. And people who don't understand that, they're not spending enough time with young people. And so I guess my last plea or question, ask of you is, tell these young people, can you tell these young people not to worry? Do you have that really in your heart of hearts, that we're going to solve our way out of this one way or the other?
The short answer is no. I'm not going to tell you everything's going to be okay. But I will say that because of my scientific training, I look at all of these climate projections in a very specific way, which is no matter what the variable you're sort of like seeing on the graph, right? You see like temperature going up and sea level going up and ocean acidification going up and like extreme weather going up. But there's, after, we know it's happened in the past, so we know that it's part of this trend. But what we don't know is exactly what the future looks like, because we don't know what we humans are going to do, right? So even though we know that the future is going to be quite different from the present because of how much we've already changed ecosystems and the composition of the air and the ocean, because of all the fossil fuels we've burned and all the greenhouse gases we've released, and how we've just torn apart ecosystems that were sort of like holding things in balance. We know that the future is different, but we don't know exactly what it looks like, because that depends on what we do, right? And so I guess when I'm like, do I get out from beneath this down comforter in the morning? My question to myself is like, what can I do to make sure we have the best possible future? Because there is such a range of possibility that still exists. And while like going back to some pristine planet is a fantasy, we still have a ton of agency. So that's kind of like, I wouldn't say I'm hopeful. I certainly count myself as a realist as opposed to an optimist. I don't assume we're going to get it together. But I think a lot about like, what would it look like if we did? And I think this is a moment that calls for quite a lot more of that dreaming, like grounded in science, but dreaming about like, what can the world look like if we get it right? That's actually the working title of the book I'm supposed to be writing. because we've got all these visions in media about sort of the climate apocalypse, right? Like the uninhabitable earth and the fire and brimstone and the day after tomorrow. Like, what does it look like when it falls completely apart? And so we know we don't want that, but we don't have a lot of good visions of what it looks like if we get it right. And I would say agriculture is actually one of the few exceptions to that, right? Like people have done a wonderful job sort of helping us really see what does an alternative food system look like. And we need to do that for all aspects of the work, because right now we have a situation where people are like, okay, I'm supposed to avoid the bad stuff, but they don't know what they're supposed to be running towards. So they're not running. It's like we're all sauntering away from the apocalypse. I think if we had a more concrete vision of the future we were contributing to, then it would help us, like, you know, pick up the pace to at least like a jog.
Okay. Well, I've got two questions that are really related, so I'll sort of package them together. And they come from Jenna and from Sam. And it's really about BIPOC farmers. So how do we engage the next generation of BIPOC farmers? Everyone that's here is interested. How do we spread the interest and knowledge? And then Sam goes on to describe it as a pipeline problem. You know, what is it that gets people feeling that they're qualified, ready to figure these things out and do the job that needs to get done?
Yeah. This is a really big question. I might be one of those students who like didn't get an A in your class because I focused too much on the problem on this paper. So there's part of it that has to do with bringing young people in and helping them see that this is a viable career. And your question reminds me of the summer that I spent working at the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, teaching. I developed this curriculum to teach inner city kids, middle school students about nature and botany through the garden. And we planted a vegetable garden together at the beginning of the summer. And, you know, they had fresh salads out of the garden every day at lunch. And most of them had never had fresh tomatoes before, which is certainly true for me growing up back when Fort Greene, Brooklyn was the inner city. And so these young people, and then you give them lab coats to do work that has like zero dangerous chemicals. It's just like mixing soil types together and seeing how things grow in different types of soil, or in the light and the dark, or if we spray, you know, simulated acid rain, just like vinegar solution on plants, like what does that do? And so I think there are all these opportunities to work with young people to show them that there's this like whole other way to interact with the world that they had never considered. But it's going to take like a full spectrum of things, right? Like making sure that people of color have access to land, because you can't become a farmer if you can't afford land, and like who can afford anything right now, you know? There's a lot of policy that like entrenches the power and distribution of influence and access that's already exists in the agricultural sector. So there's certainly some policy change that's needed. There are some changes in the financing to think about like who is able to get, who are we investing in when it comes to giving people the opportunity to buy the equipment they need, build their barns, buy land, all of that kind of stuff. So it's sort of a like all of the above kind of answer. Unfortunately, there's not like one thing that needs to be done. It's policy, it's finance, it's education, it's access to land, and it's community too, right? Like people don't want to do this alone. It's a big leap to take. And so knowing that there are people that have your back really, really matters as well. And of course, access to wonderful opportunities for education. And a lot of the, you know, resources and work that's coming out of Stone Barns is certainly remarkable in that way, showing people other ways that they can do things, which might be more appealing to them than thinking about being a farmer as just like riding around on a tractor all day and like spraying pesticides and like, you know, throwing stuff at cows for them to eat, right? So like, what does it really look like? So yeah, I don't know if that's a cop out by just like listing a whole lot of things, but there's a lot of work to be done is the short answer.
It's not a simple question, and there's no simple answer to it. So I've got a couple of questions related to oceans, which I think you know something about. So Anastasia asks, what's the biggest negative human-induced impact on oceans right now?
Climate change. So when I was in graduate school, I started in 2005 doing my PhD in marine biology. And when I started, people thought that it was still up for debate what was the primary impact on the ocean. And what people were saying was that overfishing is the primary human impact on the ocean, and climate change will at some point eclipse that. And that has certainly happened. What we're seeing is warming waters that lead to all sorts of things being out of whack. Where we mostly hear about how bad that is for coral reefs, how they can't take the heat and are bleaching. We hear a little bit, and certainly that most species, humans included, have a pretty narrow range of comfort when it comes to temperature. And fish, for example, when they're like, when the water is warmer, they have like, it puts more metabolic pressure on them so that they can need more oxygen to keep going, but also warm water holds less oxygen. So it's this double whammy of like not great for fish. And then you have things that can swim and moving away from the tropics towards the poles, trying to find cooler water, which is causing all sorts of problems with fishing and food security. So the temperature piece is one, but the other impacts of climate on the ocean are that the ocean has absorbed around 30% of the carbon dioxide that we've emitted by burning fossil fuels. So we would be in much worse shape if it weren't for the ocean buffering the impacts of climate change. But all that carbon dioxide the ocean has absorbed, it leads to this chemical reaction, which is like carbonic acid and then hydrogen ions, which change the pH of the entire ocean. So the entire ocean is now around 30% more acidic than it was 100 years ago. And that makes it hard for shellfish to grow shells. It makes it hard for corals to form their skeletons because fish and other things smell and navigate through seawater. They don't smell predators. They can't smell their prey. They don't smell where home is. And so it's causing all these sorts of like just disruptions to ecosystem dynamics. And then of course there's all the hurricanes that are pummeling things more fiercely than before, and sea level rise. And so it's a huge mess. And so, yeah, I would say, yeah, it's climate change. Pollution and plastic pollution in general gets sort of top billing now. I would say it's the most visible problem, but I wouldn't say that it's the biggest. Although, we're in this moment where we need to walk and chew gum, right? We need to stop polluting the ocean and overfishing it and also address climate change. We don't just get to pick the one we as individuals can pick which one we want to focus on, but we as society need to deal with them all.
Well, and specifically a question came in that asks, is there a particular policy or policies that you advocate for in terms of fishery regulation?
Ironically, to some perhaps, the US actually has some of the best fisheries management in the world because of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which says you can't overfish. And if you you need to have a plan to rebuild those fish populations on a specific timeline. And so the shortcut for those who don't think a lot about sustainable seafood as part of the way that they think about the food system is that local seafood in the US is probably your most sustainable option because we know US fisheries are pretty well managed. So when it comes to the opportunities there, this is one of those things that's like so simple. It seems like a lame thing to say, but like if we kill fewer fish, there will be more fish. It is actually pretty much that simple. There's a lot of science to like, well, how many can we catch and in what areas and at what times of year and at what depths, and having refuges in the form of marine parks, marine protected areas makes a huge difference, and the spillover from all the reproduction in that area can help replenish fisheries. So there's obviously a lot more to it, but the best thing about nature is that it's actually quite resilient if we just back off and give it a chance. The same is true for restoring soil systems as well.
So this is a question that you probably get quite a bit, and I know in my own climate work I do. And it is coming from a person who's an immigrant, originally from South Africa. But the general question is, how do third world nations who seem to be bearing the brunt of changes in climate right now adapt to these challenges that these nations need to progress, just like the US and European nations did through fossil fuels? And without that energy, how do they prosper? So this is that global equity question about the haves, the have-nots. How do we move forward on climate, which of course was a big part of the discussion in Paris and beyond.
So for those who don't know what Paris and beyond means, the Paris Agreement is what came out of the UN climate negotiations, where all these countries committed to doing their part to reduce emissions so that collectively we could keep planetary warming below 2 degrees Celsius. And a lot of people have not met their goals. The goals were not ambitious enough anyway to begin with. And certainly within that UN framework for how we as a global community address the climate crisis, there's a lot of discussion about the role that wealthy nations need to play vis-a-vis supporting developing nations, right? Because as you pointed to, the United States is the largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases. Over the last 100 years, we have done the most to pollute the planet, change the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So what does that mean for us? And so people also often like fall back on this very lazy argument. They're like, oh, China is now releasing more than us, so why should we do something if China isn't? It's like, you should get to be a jerk just because someone else isn't a good enough person. Like, no, that's not how this works. And we have an opportunity to be leaders, which we should embrace. So obviously it's nice that the Biden administration is like, day one, we're back in the Paris Agreement. Like, we want to be part of a global community that's addressing this. But specifically to your point, there is a mechanism for wealthy countries to support the transition off of fossil fuels for less wealthy countries. There is like a financial mechanism that's been created for that. Is it enough money? No. Has the US been paying its bills? No. So I think I'm so glad that this point got raised, and it's one of those things that like we just haven't sorted yet, right? The fact that 10 or 20 million people in Bangladesh, their homes will be underwater within the next few decades. And what are we going to do about that? And so there's the question of like, sort of like where I see the opportunity is how can a lot of places sort of leapfrog the technology in the same way that a lot of places never put up telephone poles. They never had landlines. They went straight to cell phones, right? Like, how can we sort of do the same leapfrogging of technology when it comes to energy? Just, for places that don't have natural gas, like let's just skip that phase, for example. Like, let's go straight to solar and wind and storage. So I think that's where a lot of opportunity lies. But the other thing that we absolutely must think about is like, how do we change the rules around migration? We have all these borders that we've created for various reasons, and they're really not serving us well when it comes to the fact that people are simply going to need to move out of places that are no longer habitable and for no fault of their own. And so there's an essay in All We Can Save that's about migration. And so how to even think about an issue that big when it comes to what climate is forcing people to do. So yeah, I would just throw that into the mix there.
All right, this is a very interesting question, and this I'm going to refer to you formally, Dr. Johnson. So the question is, how to bridge the link between people and Western science? Can you speak to the bias-rich peer review process and the passage of truth? You weren't expecting that one. I was neither.
So this is something that I've thought a lot about. I co-authored actually a peer-reviewed scientific article about how essentially American scientists or scientists from developed countries could be better participants as they do international research. Like, what are the tips to not be a jerk? So I'm pretty sure that paper is open access. I wrote a summary of it on National Geographic's blog. That certainly is. But our academic publishing is totally broken. We just saw an announcement in the last few weeks. I think Nature magazine is now going to charge the authors $7,000 or $8,000 to publish a paper so that we can all read it for free. But like, who has an extra $7,000 or $8,000 to get your paper published, right? You know, I've certainly paid $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000, but you know, from the organizations where I was working, paid that bill. I couldn't, as an individual scientist, and most scientists in developing countries absolutely could not pay then to ever have their work in a top journal, which means we're losing the opportunity to share some of the most important knowledge at a time when it's most important to share what science we have available on the cutting edge to make the best decisions about the way forward. So there's the academic publishing piece, which is broken, and there's like people developing whole other models of open access journals. And then on the other side, there's like, what are scientists doing like actually in these other places? How do we interact with the communities who live in the places where we're extracting samples or data? And that I've had a bunch of experience with, and I found the best way to handle that is by inviting local people to be a part of your research. When I was doing ocean policy work in the Caribbean, a part of that phase was, you know, working with island governments and communities, fishing communities in particular, was, okay, so step one, like, let's assess the ecosystem, the coral reefs, the fish populations, the water quality. And so before I put together like a team of experts in Caribbean marine ecology to do this work. But before the research started, we made sure that all the local park rangers and fisheries officers got certified as scuba divers. We brought in an instructor to teach them all they needed to know. And we donated dive gear so that they could watch what we were doing, so they could see the process, they could trust what we were doing, they would understand what the data meant, how we had come to know what we knew, and that they could help explain it to other people in their community as this information started to be used to make decisions. So that's another way, just be include. And we didn't have time to train them to identify and quickly jot down the names of all, you know, Latin names of all the species of the fish that they were seeing and have their data be part of the analysis, but we could at least make the process open for them. And for other things like measuring conch, you can learn to do that in an hour, right? We give you a ruler, we show you, you know, where the lines are, and then you're good. And there's a clipboard you take you can write underwater with a pencil, which is one of the coolest things. So, and then I think one thing that we often is an easy part, which we skip, is like, when you leave the data. Like, give these communities the opportunity to have that information for their own use in the future. You shouldn't like lock up the information in academia. We have to figure out ways to share that, and that often is a problem because researchers have no budget for like, how do we turn this over in a way that people can actually like make heads or tails of it? How do we train people in sort of like the programs that are needed to understand the data? So it's not as simple as just like, I left them a hard drive. But I think those are some of the things that come to mind for how we could do better. But I guess the last thing I'll say is we often come in with the answers in mind, and definitely with the questions in mind. And science is it's a process of inquiry. The scientific method starts with a hypothesis. And what we miss when we come in with all of our questions already as a list is we miss the chance to say, like, what do you need to know? Like, we're here with a bunch of like nerds who can help you answer questions. What would help you make better decisions about fisheries management or agriculture? Like, what information can we provide you? What phenomena are you seeing that you would like to better understand? Is it an aberration, or is this a trend that you can expect more of, right? Like, these are people who are closest, Kathleen, as you quoted, to the problem, who are then inevitably closer to the solution and have some amazing insights to share that could lead to better scientific research projects that would lead to better policies and programs and approaches. So I think have some humility that you don't have the answers, but you should be asking questions of communities, not just of science.
I am so glad that question was asked, because that was just beautiful. All right, I have one last question. We only have 2 or 3 more minutes left, and we'll share with you all the questions that have come through on the chat room box. It's great stuff, and we could talk for hours. But I do want to end with this, because in your anthology, you do so much about honoring those who came before. And the question that came up was about your mom being a regenerative farmer. And the question is, can you tell us more about that and how her work as a farmer informs your work?
What a treat to answer this question. So my mother retired right after I graduated from college, and she didn't intend to become a farmer. She did intend to move to the country, and she sort of impulse purchased a farm because she heard that it had been in the same family for 200 years and was about to be sold to developers and subdivided. And she's thought, well, I'm selling my house in Brooklyn. I can afford to buy a farm. I could put this in a land trust and make sure it's protected as agricultural land, organic agricultural land forever. And so that's what she did. She was able to buy 3 different properties by selling one home in Brooklyn, and put them all in a land trust and make sure they're conserved. And one of them had very bad topsoil. It's on the top of a hill. The slate is very close to the surface. It's just very thin. And so she wanted to start a vegetable garden. And so she realized that she needed to build topsoil and needed fertilizer. So she was like, well, I'll get a few dozen chickens. And then next thing you know, we had 400 chickens and we had to build like a whole other barn, and things got out of hand, and we had like 40 something different heritage breeds. And she was selling eggs at the food co-op. And it became this big experiment in homesteading. And we are now downscaled to about 100 chickens. But the thing that I've learned from watching her go through this process is the only reason she was able to do all this experimenting with, like, designing her own greenhouse from reclaimed windows and trying to figure out vermiculture in like a greenhouse inside a greenhouse in this like dirt trench. Can she grow enough worms to feed her chickens? How do we get off of needing to buy feed and really be a closed loop in one place? How do we do raised beds? Right. Like what does composting look like on a large scale to build topsoil? Like all of these, it's all trial and error. Even if you read all the books and watch all the YouTubes, I mean, this woman lives in a whole different part of YouTube that's just like multi-hour agricultural nerd fests. But she was only able to do this because she had a pension from being a public school teacher. And it is nearly impossible to make a living as a starting farmer, to buy your own land. People don't pay enough for food in this country to make it viable for most people. And so meeting, more so than watching my mother go through this process of becoming an organic farmer, was meeting her neighbors and learning about the challenges of dairy farmers, of like, why are people doing corn monocultures with, with pesticides? Like, what are all the forces that prevent people from doing things that are good for the earth and for us, and sort of encourage stuff that's really damaging. So I do think that approaching all of this stuff as trial and error, which is something that I always speak to the young people that I mentor, is like, trial and error is a perfectly valid way to approach the world. Like, try something, like make it, don't do something dumb on purpose, but like, if it doesn't work, try the next thing. And like, it's a process of iteration and learning. And so she's really modeled that incredibly well for me over the last 18 or so years. And I think I was there for 6 or 7 months this year. I just sort of moved back in with my mom during the pandemic. And there's something incredibly beautiful about reconnecting with the cycles of nature, right? In the city, you forget, like, you're like, oh, seasons, like, it's colder now, I'm wearing a sweater, but you don't like really experience these transitions in the same way as you do in the country. And this, the absurdity of my pace of life and the endless Zoom calls and the endless emails, when counteracted with like, the rooster is going to be up in a few hours, Ayana. Like, what are we doing with our life and our time? And just sort of thinking about, we all have the same, number of minutes in the day, and how do we want to spend them? And reconnecting with the land really put that into stark relief for me too.
Wow. Well, Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, what a pleasure to have you with us for this past hour. Really inspiring. You're an amazing young woman, an amazing scientist, an amazing leader. Everyone buy her book and encourage her to finish that next one. You need it. And I just want to, on behalf of all the people in the conference, Zoom Hollywood Squares, and on behalf of Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture, I really applaud you and thank you for being with us tonight.
What a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.